I think maybe the most intense flavor I had there was fermented eel guts, which were pretty challenging.
Hey guys, I'm Eric Olson, and welcome to another episode of the Science-Centric Podcast. I'm really excited about this episode because it combines two of my all-time favorite topics, science and food. More specifically, we're talking about the gut microbiome. That's the collection of microbes living in our digestive tracts and concentrated in the large intestine. And we're also talking about the foods that help these microbes to both survive and to thrive. Science is revealing that a healthy microbiome has a number of important benefits related to digestion, weight loss, the immune system, and even our mood. Our guest in this episode, Katherine Harmon Courage, has written a whole book on this topic titled Cultured: How Ancient Foods Can Feed Our Microbiome. We spoke about what the microbiome is exactly, what happens to our health when it gets disrupted, and also her journey around the world to find fermented foods that support a healthy gut. Before we dive into it, I just wanted to mention that you can win your very own copy of Cultured. Just head over to sciencecentric.com/giveaway for more details. Katie, welcome to the Science-Centric Podcast. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Great. I thought a good place to start, and we can talk about, all about your book and various aspects of it. But to start, could you just tell us what the microbiome is? I mean, we hear so much about this. I feel like it's in the news. And having read your book, I feel like I understand it better. But maybe for the audience, you could explain what it is exactly.
Yeah, definitely. So the microbiome, when we're talking about it, we're generally talking about the human microbiome. And so those are all of the microbes that live in us and on us. It's bacteria, fungi, archaea. We've got them all over our skins, in our guts, of course. And so that is the human microbiome. But of course, everything really has a microbiome. It's kind of a microbial world. We just happen to live in it. So your coffee maker has its own microbiome. The subways of New York have their own microbiome, which is pretty gross. Public restrooms have microbiomes. The ocean, the soil. We're surrounded by all these different biomes that are inhabited by all these different microbes. So when we talk too about the human microbiome, as I mentioned, it really is different from place to place in and on our bodies. So for this book in particular, and what a lot of the science is concerned with right now is the gut microbiome. And so these are the microbes that live. Generally, we're looking mostly in the large intestine, although there's different populations in the small intestine too. So we're just starting to figure out really how all of these microbes are impacting our health and how we've evolved with them over these, thousands and millions of years.
So we have microbiomes like in our mouth, and I think in the book you mentioned our armpits and various body parts. But why is the one in our gut so important?
Yeah, so that's where most of our microbes live. So even though we do have plenty of microbes in our armpits and our mouths, really the bulk of them, and we're talking about, on the order of pounds of microbes in our bodies, they reside in our guts and primarily in our large intestine. And so they're kind of like the last stop of our meals, if you will. So all of the food that we eat, eventually, what our bodies don't absorb ourselves, makes it down to our microbes in our large intestines, and they break down and consume a lot of this food that we haven't been able to absorb. And then they turn that into various compounds. So some of those are beneficial, some of those are harmful. So it's really, this whole ecosystem that we're putting fuel in, and then they're giving us different products. So we're just starting to really learn what exactly is going on in there and who is involved.
And why now? Like, why is this so prevalent now? Like, why did science sort of dismiss this or not know about it until now? And now you just see all kinds of probiotic yogurt and kombucha and all these different foods and things that are supposed to support the microbiome. But why was this ignored if it's so important?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it has a lot to do with the scientific technology, I think. So I started covering this almost exactly 10 years ago. I was a little intern at Scientific American, and a study crossed my desk one day as I was looking for things to write about it. And there was this consortium called the Human Microbiome Project. I thought, well, this sounds really interesting. I've always been interested in ecology. So let's see what this is all about. So that was a decade ago, and they were just starting to get a census of who was there, what microbes were in our bodies. And so it was really fascinating to learn about this unseen world that we really had no idea about previously. So the reason it was so unknown to us was really we didn't have the technology to get an accurate reading of who was there. So before, a decade or so ago, the best way was to take samples and to culture them in the lab. So if you think about taking organisms from one environment and transferring them to another environment, so the human gut, which is warm, acidic, anaerobic, and then trying to grow them in a petri dish in the lab, a lot of microbes are not going to survive that transfer. I'd say in the book, it's kind of like trying to take a sample from the Amazon River and, grow them in the desert. You're really just going to get the really, hardy, probably pathogenic species that manage to survive in that other environment. So scientists and medical professionals thought, well, there really wasn't a whole lot going on in the gut. And a lot of it, a lot of the focus was on these microbes that make us sick, which is helpful. So we learned about E. coli and listeria and these things that do live in the gut when we're ill. But we really didn't have a sense of all of these other microbes that were there that were maybe beneficial or neutral. But what really changed 10 years or so ago was the advent of genetic sequencing. And so the speed was improving, the price was coming down. If you remember, sequencing the human genome took, so long and was so expensive, and they finally sequenced it. But now, we can get our own genome, if not entirely, largely sequenced for $99 or so. So the same thing was happening in the labs with the microbes. So they were able to finally do this genetic sequencing on samples, and these microbes didn't have to survive the trip, so to speak. They could just see whose genetic material was there to begin with.
And that didn't matter. It doesn't matter if the bacteria or microbes are alive or dead, because they're going to leave that DNA behind that could be sequenced.
Exactly.
Yeah, right. Cool. So if we have a healthy microbiome, we probably feel great. There's nothing going on. We're living our lives. We're eating food. It's passing through. What happens if our microbiome is disrupted and things go terribly wrong? Which does happen. What does that look like, and what are the effects?
Yeah, so there are all different kinds of effects, and we're still learning about these different outcomes, and there can be different ways, obviously, that the microbiome can go wrong. One of the most, I think, dramatic examples is a condition called C. diff, which is short for C. difficile, which is a bacterial overgrowth in the gut, which can cause really terrible, terrible symptoms. People are often hospitalized for it, really bad gastrointestinal distress, and sometimes severely even death if it can't be treated by antibiotics. So this often actually starts because of a lot of antibiotic treatments. If people are going through intensive long-term antibiotic treatment, that can wipe out a lot of their kind of native, neutral, and beneficial gut flora. And then pathogenic bacteria like C. difficile can then kind of move in and take over. If you think about like a garden that's been, had all the plants taken out of it, it's pretty ripe, open territory for weeds to come in and start growing. So, and often there are certain strains that are resistant to antibiotics. So more antibiotic treatment doesn't help, and people can get really quite ill and die from this condition.
Yeah. So that's sort of the extreme case, right? Where you've just completely wiped out all your gut flora and fauna. Or is it fauna? I don't know.
It's more than flora. It's, we're talking about different areas of the phylogenetic tree for sure.
Those categories don't hold up in this case.
Exactly.
So that's sort of an extreme case, but I think you make a case in the book that our Western diet does not support a healthy biome. and or microbiome. So what's going on there? Why is what we're eating now compared to what we ate in the past as a species maybe making things not so optimal for our microbes?
Right. And the answer here kind of surprised me when I started researching the book. I was really interested in the probiotic and fermented foods, and it seemed like such this interesting kind of sexy topic these days. And it's everywhere now, even my local Target. Don't have to just go to the farmer's market anymore to get kimchi. Yeah. But when I started researching the book, it's really not as much about these probiotic fermented foods as it is about fiber, which is not usually a very interesting topic. Or, people don't think of it as an interesting food quality.
By the way, that's my wife is a dietitian, and that's actually her favorite topic. So I've definitely recommended this book to her because she loves to talk about fiber. So she's been validated. She's validated by your book. So
that's great. Yes. Yeah. So fiber is really the key. We have all these microbes in our gut that we're just starting to learn about, but we've been neglecting to feed them well. And in the past, for most of our evolution, our diets were extremely heavy in fiber. We were eating tubers, and nuts and berries and seeds and all of these things that are very high in fiber. But just recently, even really in the last 100 years or so, we started refining our foods so much that we've really taken the fiber out of them. And of course, these days you can get foods with fiber added back in.
Right.
But that's not quite the same as having this diverse diet of these kind of natural fibers, because that's another aspect is we want to cultivate these diverse microbiomes for our health. And that means feeding them a diversity of fibers because different microbes prefer different types of fiber. So it's not just about supplementing with one single type of fiber as much as it is eating this kind of diverse, fibrous, more rustic diet, I think.
So that's the real fundamental problem here in the Western diet. We just don't eat enough fiber.
I think that's a big part of it.
Mm-hmm. So we're eating, refined starches and potatoes and, what else? Sugar, refined sugar, obviously. That probably doesn't help.
Yeah. And actually, it's interesting that you mentioned potatoes because that was one of the surprising foods I learned about researching the fiber that feeds our microbes is there are the ones from kind of these rugged root vegetables like Jerusalem artichokes and sunchokes, these little knobby tubers. But the other form that surprised me was this form called resistant starch. And one form in particular is resistant starch of simple carbohydrates that have been cooked and then cooled. So actually, if you cook even a white pasta and then cool it and eat it as pasta salad, the starches have actually recrystallized into a form that our bodies can't break down, but that our microbes eat. So you mentioned potatoes. So cooked and cooled potatoes actually do have good fiber for our microbes.
Oh, interesting.
Which I was, happy to learn about that.
How about French fries? Is that?
Ooh, that's a good question. Maybe cold French fries if that's where you want to go.
Gross. I know those are gross because I've tried that and they're not they're not good. They're really not good. Okay.
But potato salad maybe.
That's very interesting. Okay. So it's not necessarily it's not necessarily what we would think of as health food per se, like a salad or something. It's just that we're getting this variety of fibers from different sources, and some of them are unexpected, as you mentioned. So I guess a diet that would be high in meat and fat, for example, would not be supportive of a healthy microbiome. Is that correct?
Right, exactly. And there's been some research looking at, especially, I think researchers looked especially at pork fats. This was in mouse models, but they found that microbes actually take that and they can create this, or they make this compound and release it in our body. It's called TMAO. And that's been linked to a variety of poor health outcomes like colon cancer. And so we think about nourishing the microbes and feeding them, but just because they're microbiomes don't mean that they always make good products for us. They're not always helping us. So we have to be aware of what we're feeding them too.
Interesting. Hey, I just wanted to take a quick pause to thank HostGator, this episode's sponsor. HostGator is one of the world's top 10 largest web hosting companies with over 8 million hosted domains. They have around-the-clock support, and all shared web hosting plans include a 45-day money-back guarantee. Now, I've personally used HostGator since 2008 for all of my hosting needs, and I really couldn't be happier. Sign up today using the promo code SCIENCE, and you'll receive 25% off any new hosting plan. Now, on with the show. Okay, so one theme that I encountered a number of times in the book, or one point that I felt like you were trying to make, was that the foods that we consider probiotic that we buy at the grocery store or whatever, those are not the same thing as our sort of native microbiome, but they can help. They can help boost it. They can help support it. What is the relationship there, and why do we need probiotic foods if they're not sort of our what do I want to say, native microbiome, or our persistent microbiome, I guess would maybe be a better word.
Right. And that's, I think, a really important distinction that often gets left out of the conversation. And that was the impression that I had when I first started thinking about this book was, there are all these new probiotic foods, and isn't it interesting? And this is how we can kind of reseed our guts and restore our native gut health. But as I was kind of looking into it, thinking about a book, a study came out showing that they'd given these volunteers a specific probiotic. And then when these volunteers stopped taking the probiotic, it was a matter of weeks, really, before there was no trace of that bacterium left in their systems. And I thought, well, that's too bad. There goes this book idea. So much for all that yogurt and kefir I've been eating. This is really, have to scrap this one and start over. But then I looked into it a little more, and that's where it was really interesting, is these food microbes that we eat, those microbes are evolved to really thrive in those food products, in yogurt or in sauerkraut. That's really their happy home. And then they can survive the journey in our guts, but they're not going to take up residence and really stick around and proliferate because they are, our native gut microbes evolved to live in our guts and nowhere else, really.
Yeah.
But just because these microbes that we're eating don't stick around for a long time doesn't mean they're not being beneficial and helping us along the way. So they have a lot of the same characteristics as our native microbes. They can make beneficial compounds. They kind of help regulate our immune system. So in researching the book, just traveling around the world and talking with different people and seeing how a lot of these foods are integrated into cultures, people eat them all the time. It's not kind of I'm feeling a little off, I'll have a yogurt and then go back to my regular diet.
Yeah.
Or, I had a kombucha this weekend and, now I'm going to feel great for the next 2 years. These foods are just an integral part of their daily lives and their culture, and they eat them, multiple times a day. So they're constantly getting this influx of microbes. So they're never without this extra source of all these potentially beneficial microbes.
So let's take a scenario like you have an infection, you take a course of antibiotics, and you think, gosh, I'm going to eat a yogurt and that's going to help my microbiome flourish and come back. But what's actually happening there? I mean, if you're on a course of antibiotics, does it actually wipe everything out and you're starting from scratch? Or how would your microbiome actually become reseeded then with new microbes?
Mm-hmm. So it doesn't usually totally wipe out everything, which is good. But it can kind of, deliver a hit, I think, to our native gut microbes. But what we can do, if you do, say, eat yogurt after a course of antibiotics, it is, even if those bacteria aren't repopulating your gut for the long term, they're not, they might be helping out a little bit. They can increase the acidity, which is good for our guts because that can help the native populations rebound. And they can also kind of perform some of these other tests that our native microbes do in helping to keep out invaders. And we also forget that microbes were the ones who invented antibiotics. They're an ancient, defense mechanism that other microbes use to fight off other microbes. So, they also can help fend off other harmful microbes that way too.
Cool.
But the extreme example, I guess, if you mention reseeding, is that, and this gets back to our seed to feel conversation, is the way that researchers have now found to treat really difficult cases that aren't responding to antibiotics is to reseed the gut with fecal transplants from donors. So this it's a really rigorous screening process where they can find donors to donate their healthy microbiomes for people who are super ill. And it's actually been so effective in treating people with this condition that they actually stopped some of the early studies early. Just because it was so effective, and they stopped giving the control group antibiotics and started treating them with these fecal microbiome transplants, which used to be delivered a little bit more crudely, but now they're in pill form. But you take a lot of them.
when I hear the term fecal transplant, I think they're actually like cutting open someone's gut and then transplanting it in.
You can think of it as like
from somebody else, but
it's less invasive than a blood donation. I'll say that.
Yeah, but that's for sort of extreme cases. Like
exactly.
you would not want to be, conducting these transplants every day or something else. So let's not give anybody the wrong idea that this is going to help you.
No, there's some fringe websites that have home recipes for this stuff, but I think it's best to do this under medical supervision when the samples and donations can be screened.
Yes,
first, because we really don't know so much about the microbiome and what it also can transfer to us. I mean, there have been studies in mice showing that when germ-free mice, so mice that don't have microbiomes, are given the microbiomes of humans with all sorts of conditions from anxiety to obesity, then these mice actually take on those characteristics. So we don't really understand the mechanisms quite yet for how that's happening, but it is something that we do need to be careful with as we're looking about transferring these these qualities from one human to the next.
I'm really curious what that screening process looks like, but let's save that for another conversation.
I think it's pretty rigorous. But you can actually bank your own fecal donation if you're going to be undergoing a really, severe treatment with antibiotics for a long time. Some people are banking their own microbes so that they could maybe restore their own personal microbiome rather than relying on somebody else's.
That seems, for some reason, a little more palatable. I don't know why, but it's just, it's all kind of gross. But all right, so let's talk a little bit about some of the foods that you talk about in the book that you encountered, and sounds like you did a lot of traveling to write this book. I don't know what that experience was like, if it was stressful or fun or hopefully fun, but what were some of the more interesting foods that you encountered that you hadn't found before? And are there any foods that you have incorporated into your life, your lifestyle that you're eating now that you discovered along the way?
Yeah, so I think some of the more interesting foods I encountered were in Japan. I kind of selected a key food for each country that I visited. And in Japan, I was thinking miso, because that's something that we have readily available in the US and we do eat a lot of, and it's kind of this major fermented food in Japan. But when I got there, I was just amazed, and I ate at this really amazing restaurant that really focuses on fermentation processes. So I got to taste, I think maybe the most intense flavor I had there was fermented eel guts, which were pretty challenging. I'm not big on the super fishy spectrum of foods. So, but it was really, really cool and, presented in really traditional, beautiful Japanese fashion in really small portions. So it wasn't a bowl of fermented fish, eel guts or anything. But it was really quite lovely and quite amazing to see all of these different fermented foods and the creativity that the chef had used and presenting kind of these traditional methods in more contemporary ways. Yeah,
and I thought some of the Asian foods that you talk about were probably the most interesting and the most foreign, because we have yogurt and cheese from Europe and fermented grains and things like that, which were maybe a little more we have a little bit of knowledge about because they've made it into our culture, but the Asian ones just seem so foreign. But fermented fish, that's actually pretty common in Asian cultures, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and especially in some Southeast Asian cultures, fermented fish sauce. I mean, we have fish sauce that we
Yeah.
use in our cooking oftentimes, but it's probably been pasteurized. But in Southeast Asia, it's a really common condiment, and they ferment actually all of these small catches in these giant vats at really high, ambient air temperature, which is really warm. So yeah, it's this kind of funky fermented fish slurry, which is pretty
Ugh.
different than what we usually encounter, when we think about sauerkraut or
Yeah, right.
wild fermented pickles or something.
Yeah. And you brought up a point there, which is that a lot of these traditional fermented foods that help support a healthy gut are being sort of homogenized, pasteurized. And so are they losing their benefits that they had in the past?
Yeah, exactly. And so this is kind of a crucial point, I think, in history, just as a lot of this pasteurization has taken hold, especially in other countries around the world. And also, like you mentioned, kind of consolidating things into kind of single strain or multi-strain processes rather than this old, more traditional wild fermentation process. So researchers are actually kind of racing around the world right now to sequence the genome of a lot of these foods because we are losing that microbial diversity as the process changes and gets more industrialized, and people decide they need to be freaked out all of a sudden about these foods, that have been safe for thousands of years.
Yeah.
Because they're not strictly controlled in these, sterile environments. So it's kind of, I think, a tipping point that we're at right now. We're trying to figure out exactly what is out there and the processes that these microbes are using to make these foods. But at the same time, this industrial force of trying to regulate everything. So it's an interesting juncture we're at.
Yeah.
Right now.
Well, and it's, even some of these larger manufacturers of these foods, you mentioned that, they have these cultures, these microbial cultures that go back hundreds of years. And you had a great story in the book about a soy sauce factory that was just destroyed in Fukushima. That I don't want to give away your whole book, but I thought that was so funny. That could you just talk about that for a little bit, or just tell us what happened there?
Yeah, absolutely. So like you said, a lot of these production companies have been, in the same family for generations and using the same equipment, especially, wooden equipment, these wooden aging rooms, that the microbes that go into making the food have actually established themselves in the room, in the area. So these areas have taken on their own microbiome that then help inoculate the food to really make it quintessentially from this producer. And so as you mentioned, during Fukushima, after the earthquake and tsunami, this one soy sauce factory in Japan was completely wiped out. Their building was gone, their stock was gone, so they really had no way of reestablishing their own soy sauce. So they were kind of despairing because it had been, in the family for generations. And then it came out that a local university that had also sustained a lot of damage had one bottle in a freezer, I guess, that the company had donated for research. And so from this one bottle of soy sauce, they were able to rescue the cultures and reestablish their own quintessential soy sauce. So that was kind of a cool story that I came across.
That is so cool. And that's the cool thing about living organisms, that they can reconstitute themselves in that way. Whereas if you lost some other chemical formula or something, you wouldn't be able to do that. Very cool. So what are foods that in the United States, who I imagine is most of the audience for this podcast at this point, what foods do we have access to that we can eat or buy that would help us support a healthy gut and microbiome?
Yeah, so on the fermented food side of things, I think it's a really exciting time. We're finally starting to get more of these foods in our, daily lives. Like I mentioned, we can get, we just discovered that Target started selling kimchi in our town, and kombucha and all these cool foods that do have live organisms in them. So I think they're more accessible now to us than they have been ever in the States. But then on the other side, as we talked about, the fiber part of the equation, which I think is really almost more important, even if it's doesn't sound as exciting. But it doesn't have to be kind of this drag, cardboard tasting breakfast cereals that we think of, like All Bran or something from the 80s and 90s. There's really fiber everywhere, and it's simple, it can be as simple as adding some beans to your salad at lunch, or, making sure you have more, whole oats in your oatmeal rather than super instant oatmeal. And one of the favorite foods that I found researching the book was that unsweetened cocoa powder actually has prebiotic fibers in it. So I was excited to learn about that. So I started drinking unsweetened hot cocoa in the mornings, which, is delicious and also seems good for your microbes.
Well,
so I think it's really everywhere. We just have to be a little bit more conscientious of making these small choices throughout the day to help feed our microbes.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people are going to be happy to hear that cocoa is part of the, supporting a healthy gut flora. Anyways, the book, again, is called Cultured: How Ancient Foods Can Feed Our Microbiome. We barely scratched the surface of it. There's so much great information in it, and you're such a gifted writer that it was really a pleasure to read. So everybody should check it out.
Thank you.
And Katie, thanks so much for coming on the podcast, and it's great to talk with you again.
Thanks. Nice to talk with you, Eric.
All right. Well, that's it for this show. If you learned something, be sure to smash the like and subscribe buttons. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.